Welcome back to Wordy Wednesday. So we are at the end of the year. And I don't know about you, but for me, the end of the year makes me think about history, things gone by. So I thought that today we would talk about the history of our language. And we've touched on this before, but I thought I would give you a more comprehensive view of where this incredible language of ours came from. So, when we come back. So, in case the prehensile tale hasn't given it away, Audie is here with me. He's been sort of on his winter break lately. It's been cold, so it seems all he really wants to do lately is just find himself a nice warm spot and sleep. But today he's decided to share the video with us, and as soon as I turned on the camera, right here in my lap, so we are back to being Photobomb Kitty. So, where did our language come from? There are a number of language families, and we have about 6 major language families. Indo-European, that's ours. Afro-Asiatic, by the way, I'm reading from a list here because I know if I don't, I'm going to forget one of them. Afro-Asiatic is the languages of Northern Africa. Sino-Tibetan, you have Chinese being the major language in that group. Niger-Congo, which is the languages of Central Africa. Austronesian, those are the languages of the South Pacific. Trans-New Guinea, another language family in that area. All right. And I wanted to throw in another. This is not a major language family, but for us as Americans, it does have some significance. And that's Oto-Manguean. And although not a major language family by the traditional meaning of the word, those are the native languages in Central America, because it's inevitable when you start talking about language families that for those of us in the United States, we start to wonder about all of those Native American languages and what language family they came from. And so, as a small digression, I'm just going to throw this in. The many, many Native American languages we have, most of them do not fit into language families. Most of them were developed independently. So they will be a language family of 1 or 3, which is why they are not usually included in the list of major language families. So, away from the digression and back to our major language families. Proto-Indo-European is where our language came from. Obviously, we have Indo-European, the languages of India, the languages of Europe. And in that group of Proto-Indo-European, there are many subfamilies. So let's start talking about Proto-Indo-European. Where did it come from and who spoke it? So this is theoretical. And I say that because I know when you say theoretical, people are inclined to say, oh, well, that doesn't mean it's really so. Very, very well-grounded theories. Now, the reason we are always going to have to say this is theoretical is because no one speaks it anymore. It was not a written language. It predates that. And all we can do is speculate. But the speculation is very well grounded, so we say theory, but you can pretty much take this as about as certain as we can be about anything that took place that long ago. So how long ago was that? Well, 4,500 BCE. Let me take another digression. Why do I say BCE? All right, BCE stands for before the Common Era. Now, for most of us, at least most of us my age, we are accustomed to hearing dates in terms of AD, BC. In other words, before Christ, or Anno Domini, meaning the year of our Lord. Well, I don't use that. I will use BCE, meaning before the Common Era, and CE, meaning the Common Era. So BCE corresponds to BC, and CE corresponds to AD. And the reason I use that is because, the reason I use that personally is because it's pretty clear Jesus was not born in the year 1. So I see no reason to perpetuate a bizarre medieval mistake, and because it's not inclusive. I'm very uncomfortable describing world events from the context of a small Christian population that excludes such a large portion of the world. So that's why I use it. So 4,500 BCE is roughly 6,500 years ago. So 6,500 years ago, there was a group of people that we call Kurgan. Kurgan simply refers to their burial mounds. In all likelihood, they had a word for themselves that probably corresponded with their word for people or human beings. So why would I say that? Remember that previous digression about the Native American languages? Most of those languages, the names of the tribes of people speaking them, that was their word for people. So, for example, there were people in the United States, they called themselves the Lenape, Native American word in their language for the people. Now, it gets even better than this, because then you have the Lenni Lenape. The Lenni Lenape were the real people, as opposed to other people who might call themselves people, but who really aren't. And you see that all over Native American languages. The word for their tribe is the word for people. So in all likelihood, the people who spoke Proto-European, 4,500 BCE, probably called themselves the people. What else would they call themselves? They're certainly not going to call themselves the strangers, the barbarians, the invading hordes. So just so we're clear about that, Kurgan is a word we have thrown on them. It's not a word that they would have used to describe themselves. They came from the steppes of Russia, probably in the area that we now know as Kazakhstan. So let me show you a map, first of all, of Kazakhstan. Here you go. And then let's take a look at a larger map of the area. So the Kurgan came from the area to the very, very west of Kazakhstan, extending from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea. It's a nice little area in there, the steppes of Russia. They were a pastoral nomadic people. In other words, they were farmers. They probably had a matrilineal, matrifocal society, meaning that descent passed through the mothers, and the women, as is often the case in pastoral societies, were the seat of power. Usually what happens is in more aggressive, warlike societies, you have the patrilineal coming from the father. So this is one of those women first moments. Now, they were pastoral, but they were also nomadic, because in addition to giving us Proto-Indo-European, this language family, they also are credited with domestication of the horse. That would have happened around 3000 BCE. So these folks were pastoral and they were nomadic, and that's important because their language was disseminated very widely. So at some point, and here's where it gets tricky, I said that the whole theory about Proto-Indo-European, the Kurgan, is a very solid theory. When Proto-Indo-European broke off into the separate subfamilies, for example, Proto-Germanic, the Hellenic languages, that includes Greek, the Persian languages, the Indian languages, the Romance languages, the Slavic languages. Well, that's not so cut and dried. The difference in the time frame on that goes from about 3500 BCE to 500 BCE. Now, that's a huge gap. That's a gap of 3,000 years. So, do we know when the different language families broke off? No. The theories are all over the place at this point. I do not have a personal theory on this. I would have to say, though, that I would give a lot more credence to earlier theories before 500 BCE than a theory that holds it was around 500 BCE. I just don't think we could have that much language change in that short a period of time. My personal opinion. As I say, the theories are just all over the place on this. Anyway, our Kurgan people who have the horse out on the steppes begin to migrate outward. They go into India, they go into the Middle East, they go into Europe. And as they separate, their languages become separate. And as I say, with the horse, boy, they could separate. This is not a question of people moving as far as one can walk in an afternoon. These are people who could travel some serious distances. So one group of people, and we are following our own group of people, moved in to the area of Western Europe. And this group of people were the speakers of Proto-Germanic. So that's the thread we're following, from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic. Now, within the Proto-Germanic family, you have many breakaways. You have English, you have German, you have the Celtic languages, the Scandinavian languages, all of the languages that are related to ours. So, and as I say, I can't give you a time frame on this because the theories are all over the place on this. At some point, and we don't know when, the Proto-Germanic speakers broke away. Some of them remained in Germany. Their language evolved into German. Others went north into Scandinavia. We have the Scandinavian languages from that. Others went to England. We don't have the English language from that, not yet. So let's go back, take another look at a map, and this time we are going to look at Western Europe. So, did you notice how close England is to continental Europe? Dover to Calais, the English Channel. Well, at one time that was a land bridge, and everybody is quite certain of that because, in fact, they say there are sandbars that at certain times of year are visible, and the distance is so short that people actually swim back and forth from Dover to Calais. They swim the English Channel. So we're talking about a relatively tiny distance. And there was a land bridge at one point. And the speakers of Proto-Germanic moved across that land bridge from France, most likely, although it wasn't France at the time, but from the area we now know as France, let us say. Moved across, went to England. And they gave us the Celtic languages, Gaelic, Welsh, Scottish, Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, they're both considered Gaelics, Cornish, Manx, and some of these languages are still very much alive. Welsh is a spoken language in Wales. Not all the Welsh speak Welsh, but many of them do. And Cornish was spoken, I think the last Cornish speaker, native Cornish speaker, died only about 100 years ago. So right up into modern times, Cornish was a spoken language. Manx died out a little before then, but people are now learning Manx. Keep in mind, a language that went right into the 19th century will have a written language. So it can be studied, it can be revived. People are doing that. So in Great Britain, the big mass of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, if you will, it's not part of the same landmass, but part of the same group. Same thing with Manx, it's the Isle of Man. And all of these areas that we currently know as Great Britain now, they were speaking Celtic languages. So, how do we get from there to English? We have yet another group of Proto-Germanic speakers. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, who go in to Great Britain, to England, to Ireland, to Wales, to Scotland, move over at a later date, bringing a different version of, well, 3 different versions most likely, of Proto-Germanic. Now remember, every time a group moves away from the parent group, over time their language changes. It may not change a lot, but it changes. So as we move away, we now have the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes moving to Great Britain and living among the Celtic speakers. Now, it used to be there was a theory that the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, came over and killed off all the Celts. No, very unlikely. For starters, there's no evidence of that kind of slaughter. And for another thing, the scope of that kind of annihilation was probably well beyond the capabilities of the people at that time. I mean, we're talking, like Hiroshima devastation to wipe out a people to that extent. So they probably came over as settlers, intermarried with the local population, but their language took over. We have very little Celtic influence in our language, but we have it. And it's some of the really unique features of our language go back to this. Let me give you an example. If I were to walk up to you and say, I say there, Johnny, you have a book in your hand. What are you doing? You would say, I am reading. You would not say, I read. For that to happen, I would have to go up to you and say, I say there, Ivan, what are you doing? And you would have to look at me with a thick accent and say, I read. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. A native speaker doesn't do that. Everyone else does. We are the only speakers, and by we, I mean speakers of English, who express ourselves in that way. When we say I read, we are referring to the habitual condition of reading. I read frequently. I read a lot. I don't read very much. When we talk about an action we are undertaking at the moment, we throw in am. I am reading. We're the only people who do that. Like in the entire world, it's just us. And that is a Celtic language convention. And it's so fundamental to the way we express ourselves that when people say, no Celtic involved, no, they are overlooking like this fundamental concept, not just of how we express ourselves, but how we think. Because we think in terms of I am doing something at this moment. But if I simply say I do it, we're talking globally. We're not talking, if I say I read, I read. You know that doesn't mean I'm reading right now. On the other hand, if a French speaker said it, you would expect to see a book in their hand. So, at this point, we have a language that I'm going to call Anglo-Saxon. That's for convenience, because initially that language, and when I say initially, I'm talking about between 1,000 or between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago. So between, say, the year 1 and the year 500, it's a language we're going to call Anglo-Saxon. In there, we have at least 6 languages. Northumbrian, Mercian, West Saxon. West Saxon, by the way, is the one that took over. So, why? Well, England had a number of small kingdoms, and England was unified, as we all know, by Alfred the Great, and everybody remembers the story of Alfred burning the bread. Well, we don't in the United States. Every British school child will tell you about Alfred burning the bread. King Alfred unified the country, and the language of his court was West Saxon. So, that is what we consider Old English. That's where the earliest writing came from. And remember, Alfred was a great supporter of literacy. He was a patron of the Church, of literacy. So much of what survives in terms of written records is West Saxon. Eventually, that became what we know as Old English, and over time, because England is an island, there were many other influences. I've already mentioned the Celtic influence. That was the influence of the people who were there first. Scandinavians came in, and the Scandinavians greatly simplified the English language. They gave us something very, very close to what we could identify as English. Their language was remarkably similar to ours. And let me give you an example. We've talked about this in book club, that maybe we might want to hit Stieg Larsson. Can you see the title? I will print it out for you. Men som heter kvinnor. I know, you're thinking, I don't understand what that means. This is the girl with the dragon tattoo, and the original title is Men, where were you? Men who hate. Men som heter. Okay, you can see that right there. Kvinnor. Now, that one is a bit of a puzzler until I point out to you that KV in Swedish corresponds to QU in English. So instead of kvinnor, how about we look at kvinnor, queen. Men who hate women. We just took the Swedish word for women and applied it to the wife of the king. These are incredibly similar languages. And all right, I will say that because that was my first language, Swedish. To me, the difference between Swedish and English is some different conjugations and a different accent. I can still go through this book and pull out words that I have never read in Swedish and easily tell you what they are in English because they are so similar. Remember, Swedish is another Proto-Germanic language, comes from that same family. So when the Scandinavians came over to raid/trade with the people of England, many of them stayed. In fact, England had Scandinavian kings for a period of time. We know that period as the Danelaw. They simplified the language. We have the language we now speak because starting off in the Russian steppes, people had the Proto-Indo-European language, got on their horses, and they moved westward, ended up in Germany, where they created Proto-Germanic, moved over to England, where they created the Celtic languages. Then the next wave of immigration went over to England with the Anglo-Saxon language, and then down from the north, another Germanic-speaking people brought Scandinavian down. So that is half an hour's worth of English language history. So thank you so much for being with me. And I will see you all tomorrow evening, book club, 8 o'clock. For those of you who are not book clubbies, have a happy new year.